Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. The title of our video today is David and Psalm 51. I chose that title because this is a very important psalm that David wrote after his sin with Bathsheba. Most of you who have studied the Old Testament at all are going to be familiar with King David, and you're going to know about his great failure when he saw Bathsheba bathing on the rooftop of her home and lusted after her, although she was married to another man, and committed adultery with her, and then conspired to have her husband, Uriah, killed in battle so he could have Bathsheba as his own. It was a terrible time in David's life. You know, he had been the man who was referred to by God as a man after my own heart. That's what God said about David. So make no mistake about it, David was a great, great man. And yet he was not a perfect man. There were no perfect human beings, never have been. The only one was Jesus. He's the only one who was ever sinless and ever will be sinless. David wasn't Jesus. David wasn't the Messiah. David was simply a man who was capable of mistakes just as well as any of the rest of us. But he was a great man and did some great things, but he failed more than once. And his greatest failure was probably his sin with Bathsheba. And he wasn't even aware of it. His thinking was so messed up at the time, he wasn't even aware of it. And so God sent the prophet Nathan to confront David and make his sin known to him. And after David was confronted by Nathan, then he realized what he had done, and he became heartbroken. And the result of all of that was Psalm 51. Now, the reason we need to pay close attention to Psalm 51 and what it says and understand what David was doing and what David was not doing is because this psalm is used to support an idea that mostly the credit for it goes to Augustine, and then later it was picked up by John Calvin. But it's the idea that when Adam and Eve first sinned, they experienced a fall, what's called a fall from grace, and their nature was fundamentally changed and became depraved, and they, and subsequently all other human beings, became incapable of doing and being good. Now, the problem with all of that is that the Bible just doesn't teach that anywhere. It's not in the Bible. If you go back and read Genesis 3, you'll find that there's nothing there about a fall. There's nothing there about human nature being fundamentally changed. There's nothing there about human beings being totally depraved and incapable of being good. And there's nothing there about the original sin that then gets passed on from generation to generation, from person to person, so that all people are, when they are born sinful. Now, if you can't find that specifically in the Bible, then how do you support an idea like that? Well, in this psalm that we're going to read in a moment, or at least some of it, you have a verse where something David says is taken to mean that people are born with sin, and that sin gets carried on from one generation to the next to the next. And it's a misunderstanding of what David was doing, is what it is. And so that's what I want us to talk about today. So we're going to begin by reading the first 5 verses of Psalm 51, and I'll be reading from the New International Version, the NIV, Psalm 51. David says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion. Blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak, and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Surely you desire truth in the inner parts. You teach me wisdom in the inmost place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean." I read a couple of additional verses there. But what we see here, and what is important for us to understand, is that when Nathan went to David and pointed out to him what he had done, we must understand how terribly heartbroken David was. David was the young shepherd who was anointed by Samuel to be the king of Israel following Saul. And he really was just an inexperienced young man. But God saw something in him. He saw that David had something inside him. David's heart was such that he would make a good king, and he would do all the things that God asked him to do. And that's why God referred to him as a man after my own heart, because David was just such a great person. And he did a lot of great things in his life. When I was a young boy, my very favorite Bible story in the entire Bible was the story of David and Goliath. And we had a great big family Bible that had lots of great art in it, great pictures in it. And I would stand there sometimes for a long time, turning the pages and looking at these pictures that depicted great scenes from the Bible. But the most important one to me, my favorite one, was the picture of David and Goliath. David was a great king, and he's gone down in history as a great man, and not just in Hebrew history, but in history in general. Everybody has heard about King David, and they remember the things that he did in those ancient times. So here's a great man who has a significant and important relationship with God. You read through the Psalms, that's very obvious. Many of them were written by David, and you can see what a deep and important and powerful relationship he had with God. And yet, he was still a human being. He was still a man. He was capable of being tempted and capable of yielding to the temptation. And on this occasion, with Bathsheba, he did. And when Nathan came and confronted David with his sin, David was so utterly heartbroken. He was just devastated because of what he had done, right? And so we don't know exactly whether it was later that day or the next day or whatever, after he had spent so much time grieving, over his sin, probably praying to God. Then he sits down to write Psalm 51, and it is his heartfelt expression of what happened. And if you read the entire psalm, you realize that David here is so very sorrowful and so very ashamed of what he did, that he is filled with self-loathing. And basically he's saying, man, I am horrible. I'm a horrible person. I'm terrible. I've always been a sinful person. And this kind of self-loathing is very typical of someone who has disappointed themselves by behaving badly, doing something they know is wrong, that they do not advocate in any way, that they certainly hadn't planned it out. They didn't intend to do this. It just sort of happened. And then when they realize what they did, they are just so deeply ashamed that they then engage in self-loathing. Now, people who have training in psychology and in therapy, and perhaps that's part of their job, is counseling people, right? Because I have one of those degrees, we are familiar with this concept of self-loathing and people coming and talking about how terrible they are, how awful they are, they did this terrible thing, how can they ever forgive themselves, how can God forgive them because they can't forgive themselves, and on and on and on they go. And it's very normal, it's very typical. All of us who've done any counseling for very long have encountered people who engage in that sort of thing. And that's what David is doing here. And with a little help, people generally come through it, and they come out the other end, and they realize, okay, they made a mistake, and God loves them, God will forgive them, they need to forgive themselves, and they work through it, and they're fine. And I think that was true of David as well. He worked through it, and he came out the other side of it probably stronger and better than he had been before. But while he was in it, while he was experiencing the sadness and the sorrow and the disappointment and being so, it's hard to find enough adjectives to describe how terrible that he felt, just being totally disappointed in himself. That while he was doing that, he's saying all these things about himself that aren't necessarily true, but they're the way he feels at the time, right? Because he's so low and he feels so terrible, and he's engaging in this self-loathing. And that's what he's doing in verse 5 when he says, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." Now, the problem is that Augustine took this verse literally, and he understood David to be teaching a theological truth. And what I'm telling you today is that David wasn't doing any such thing. David was not teaching any kind of theological truth here. He is exaggerating his sinfulness. He's saying, my whole life I've been a sinner. From the time I was born, I've been a sinner. How could he be sinful from the time he was born? Babies can't do anything. They can't think sinful thoughts. They can't do sinful things, right? We often say, my whole life, I have been such my whole life. I'm 71 years old, right, this year in 2022. I'm 71 years old. Okay, and I've been a minister, a teacher my whole life. Well, yeah, but not literally. Actually, about 51 years of those 71 years, right? Because for the first few years of my life, when I was a baby, I wasn't a teacher or a minister. When I was a young boy, I wasn't a teacher or a minister. When I was a teenager, I wasn't any kind of a teacher or minister. I did not begin doing that in any kind of serious way until I was 20 years old. Okay? But I have said, I've been a minister my whole life. Well, okay, I can say that, but what it means is my whole adult life. Okay? It doesn't mean when I was 3 months old, I was a minister and a teacher. See? You understand? We use words to say things that we know people will understand. We're exaggerating a little bit. Okay? I've been a minister my whole life. Well, yeah, but not really. My whole adult life. But what about the first 20 years when I wasn't an adult? When I was a kid? When I was a baby? When I was incapable of doing anything? I wasn't a minister then. Wasn't a teacher then. So technically, I have not been a minister my whole life. Have I? No, I haven't. But we say things like that, don't we? And we're not lying when we do it. When I say I've been a minister my whole life, I'm not lying. I'm not attempting to deceive anyone. But it's not a technically accurate statement, because there was a portion of my life where I was not capable of being a minister or a teacher. I was a child or a baby, right? Or a young person. And as I matured and became older, smarter, had some training, then I was capable of engaging in teaching and ministry. So my whole adult life, okay? That's what David is doing here. He's exaggerating something because he feels so terrible. He feels the weight of his sin so great that he says, I've been a sinner my whole life. Yeah, well, okay, his whole life from the time he was old enough to be capable of sinning. You see? Not when he was an infant. He's exaggerating. He's saying, my whole life. You can't take that kind of a statement to be a theological truth and then build an entire theological superstructure around it, and then that is just accepted as truth, because it isn't truth. And you were not sinful when you were born. You were innocent when you were born. You're not sinful until you break God's law, until you miss the mark, until you choose to do wrong, because you know the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil. You see, that's when you become a sinner, when you know what you should do and you don't, or you know what you should not do and you do it anyway, right? You're not guilty of sin until you know the difference between right and wrong and you choose to do wrong. Well, how do I know that? Well, we can go to the book of Ezekiel. And there's a passage in the book of Ezekiel, verse 18, beginning with verse 20. Well, it is verse 20. The whole thing's in verse 20. Ezekiel 18:20. The prophet says, the soul who sins is the one who will die. The son will not share the guilt of the father, nor will the father share the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous man will be credited to him, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against him. So the idea that sin, or the guilt of sin, gets passed on from one generation to another is not biblical. And if someone says, well, yes, that's true, but that original sin is... No. Okay, if sin, the guilt of sin cannot be passed on from one generation to the next, then that original sin cannot be passed on, from Adam and Eve to their kids, Cain and Abel, and then to their families, and then their families, and then their families, etc., etc., etc. It just doesn't work that way. Okay? Augustine was wrong in teaching that there was this fall. There was no fall. They just sinned. But to describe that as a fall is using terminology that's not in the Bible. And to say that when that happened, human nature was fundamentally changed and people are no longer capable of doing good or being good, that is just not true. Not only does that not say that in the Bible, it's clear if you look around that that is simply not the case. There are many people who are not Christians. Many of them do not acknowledge God in any way, shape, or form. And yet they are good people. They love their families. They love their neighbors. They're generous. They're helpful. They don't run around doing all kinds of horrible, ugly things for which people can get arrested, or hurting people, or being ugly to people. They're nice people. They're good people. Okay? Now, can they be good enough to be saved from the times when they do sin? No. Nobody can do that. That's not what we're saying. Okay? I'm not saying a person can be good enough to be saved by their own behavior. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying people can be good. They can be kind. They can be generous. They can be helpful. even if they don't know God, even if they don't acknowledge God. Okay, so the very idea that human beings are depraved and corrupted and incapable of doing good until God enters their life and changes them, back into good people, then and helps them to. That's just not biblical. That is false teaching. Okay, you trace it back to John Calvin and back from him on to Augustine, and it's a fundamental concept of Catholic theology, and it is wrong. It is not biblical. Okay, so David cannot be used to support the idea that we're born in sin. That's not what he was doing. He was not teaching a theological truth. He was grieving over the horrible sin he committed, and he was engaging in self-loathing, saying, I'm a terrible person. I've been a sinner my whole life. Yeah, and I've been a minister my whole life too. Except not really, because there were 20 years there at the beginning when I wasn't a minister and I wasn't a teacher. Okay? That's all David was doing. So we need to be careful when we're reading and interpreting the Bible. We need to be very careful not to engage in simplistic literalism every time we read something in the Bible and think, well, because David said this, that means exactly what it says, and that's the theological truth that's there. That people don't communicate that way. That's not the way we communicate. It's not the way we talk. It's not the way we, get ideas from our heads into somebody else's heads. We use a lot of figures and we do a lot of things, use symbols and all sorts of things to make a point that people will understand, and it doesn't mean that it's all entirely technically accurate. And so we need to use our heads about how we understand what the Bible says. Think about this, pray about it, read Psalm 51, see if you can't see there what David is doing, how horrible he feels, and then read that passage in Ezekiel 18, verse 20, so that you can read that yourself and see that sin is not something that's passed on. You're guilty of sin when you sin. You're not born in sin. You were born innocent and pure, and babies that encounter some difficulty and die when they're children, they go straight to be with God, right? Because they're innocent. They haven't done anything wrong. So think about these things, pray about them, and understand the grace and mercy of God in all that he is and in his dealings with us. And generally, read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.